Notre Dame showed some maturity in that game, certainly showed that they were prepared for BC. They weren't going to let down. And maybe this is just kind of a different level Notre Dame team.
Yeah, and I mean I think that's one thing that a lot of Notre Dame fans are seeing right now. I mean, they made a lot of mistakes in that game. They fumbled the ball a couple times, and it was one of those games where they pretty much dominated from a possession standpoint, from a yardage standpoint, and so on and so forth. But they kind of let Boston College, to an extent, hang around, or at least give them a little bit of hope. Because they kept turning the ball over. I think they had 3 fumbles, and all of them were recovered by Boston College, which is crazy to think about. But overall, I mean, that's a game that maybe 3 years ago they lose because they just didn't. Maybe they didn't have the talent. Maybe their offense wasn't able to physically dominate the entire game like they did. So it's good to see that they have a level of cushion that we know that some of those elite teams like Bama, Clemson, and Ohio State have.
So now Notre Dame's off. They're undefeated. They take on North Carolina next. And that was one of the games I pegged preseason as a key game once it was announced Notre Dame would be playing an ACC schedule and competing for the conference championship. Actually, my selection was Notre Dame and North Carolina to tie for the ACC championship game second slot at 9-2. So here they are coming up. Carolina doesn't need to take a backseat to anyone offensively. They probably have a top 5 offense in the country with Sam Howell, all the playmakers on the outside. Javonte Williams is little regarded nationally, but he's averaging like 8 yards per carry. They are so explosive, but giving up ridiculous amounts of points to teams like Wake Forest and Virginia.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's where the game's won. I mean, if I had to pick right now, I mean, it is a road game. Notre Dame's a little bit banged up right now. Fortunately, they have the bye week, so they can kind of get some of their guys healthy. But I don't see it, kind of like how Boston College was. I thought Boston College would be able to score a little bit. Just Jerkovic's a talented weapon, and they have a couple other. They have some good receivers. Their tight end's good, and that's kind of the same way I view North Carolina, but just maybe on steroids, I guess. Sam Howell, I think, is a better quarterback than Jerkovic at this point. One of my favorite quarterbacks in the country, actually. And then, like you said, their running backs, averaging 8 yards a carry, which is really impressive. But I'm not sure that they'll be able to keep up the pace with Notre Dame overall. And that's one thing I actually mentioned right after the Boston College games. It really looks like Notre Dame's going to be able to move the ball against anyone. And because their defense is talented and good, and for the most part pretty healthy as well. I just don't see how most teams in the country are going to be able to match them, touchdown for touchdown, essentially.
You mentioned Jerkovic and his performance against Notre Dame. A lot was made, of course, for obvious reasons, and should be made. Him transferring from Notre Dame to BC and then getting a shot at the Irish, it not turning out too well for him. But in watching the game, did you gather anything was different about the way he approached the game, the way Notre Dame players approached him? There were a number of anecdotes that were passed along during the game about his relationship with Ian Book, his relationship, and still having a number of friends on the Notre Dame team.
I will say, just as a fan standpoint, it was kind of annoying during the game to have to listen to that, because I thought that it was a little overblown. Kids transfer all the time these days, and I get that it's a cool storyline, but man, I mean, let's watch some football without having to mention a kid's name every 5 seconds. And a couple other people mentioned it too, is, Notre Dame has a few guys that were sort of in the same situation as him, maybe playing different positions, but they stuck it out. And now they're playing key roles on the roster, and they were barely mentioned. And I think that that's almost something that you should mention even more so, because I think those are cool stories as well, I guess. Other than that, though, I mean, like I said, he's a talented player. I don't think he's fully there yet. I mean, I think he leads the ACC in passing yardage. I mean, obviously there's the talent level there. He's a good runner. Really physical in terms of, I think he's like 6'5", 240. So a lot of people kind of are comparing him to Big Ben. He's from the Pittsburgh area. So, I mean, that comparison obviously is there because of that reason, I think, to an extent. But, yeah, no, he struggled. I mean, Notre Dame, I think Clark Lee specifically, as his former one of his former coaches, was able to kind of lock in on, what he does well, and he kept him for the most part inside the pocket and didn't really let him get out of the pocket and make plays. And I think he finished 18 for 40. So even though he had some yardage and he didn't really turn the ball over a whole lot, maybe some of those were a little lucky. I think they called the phantom face mask call, which maybe would have been a pick six. And ended up being a Boston College touchdown after that a few plays later. But yeah, no, I think the kid's gonna have has a good career ahead of him, and at least for that specific day, I think Notre Dame had his number overall.
Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Lock it in right here. Please give us a like, and also share the videos on social media. A lot of people out there obviously don't know we're around talking college football every day. Once you subscribe, hit that bell for the notifications, and you can catch up with our live streams, which go on all week. Ian Book played a really clean game against BC, and I watched most of this game until it failed to be competitive. 20 of 27 for 285, 3 touchdowns, no picks. I don't always buy into these kind of narratives and storylines, but do you think there's a possibility that maybe he's just an extra level of confidence in his abilities since he pulled it off against Clemson?
I think, yeah. I mean, I think that's a pretty good observation. Probably maybe the 2 best games he's played in his Notre Dame career, at least back to back, and against like quality competition. Obviously, I mean, that's something to be said. I mean, when he's playing New Mexico or playing South Florida or something like that, he's going to put up some big numbers, of course. But at least in terms of, Power 5, one of them being the number 1 team in the country, another one being a rival of sorts. You're playing your former backup QB that's obviously, wants your number, and that can bring out some emotion, of course, as well. So, no, I mean, I think maybe yesterday or Saturday was Book's best game of his career. And then Clemson probably was right up there in terms of top 5 in terms of numbers. I mean, that's going to go down as a legacy game for him overall. But no, he's playing a level of football right now that I don't think we've seen him play.
Notre Dame, North Carolina, the day after Thanksgiving, 3:30 Eastern time on ABC. That should be a fun one. And Notre Dame even getting some respect at this point, Nathan, where it's almost conventional thought that even if they lose the ACC championship game, they could make the playoff.
Yeah, I think the only thing that could change that, obviously, outside of a loss or something like that prior to that and still making the ACC championship game, if they lose, and whether or not people want to agree with this or not, if they lose pretty big while Lawrence is the quarterback, then I could see maybe, an Oregon that's undefeated, or, whoever making it in over Notre Dame. But if it's a close game, if they're able to score and look productive again like they did, in the game a couple weekends ago, I think it's going to be hard to keep both teams out. Now, obviously, if Clemson loses the second time, then maybe there's a more legitimate argument to have them out. Instead of maybe over an Oregon or something like that. But if they both go 1-1 against each other and both games are really good, really close games, then I think that you probably got to put them back in there.
Now, of course, your evaluation could change if they don't look the part against North Carolina, or certainly in an ACC championship game rematch. But as it stands right now, assuming we get the chalk formula, Ohio State, Alabama, Clemson, and then Notre Dame's the 4th team, would you feel, based on what you've seen from the other teams and know about the other teams and Notre Dame to date, feel more confident, not necessarily that they just go out there and win these games, but that they're in that pack of 4 legitimately and could represent themselves well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think just the way that they handled themselves against Clemson, and we talked about this when, post game after that after that performance. I mean, they moved the ball against that kind of defense, even regardless of the injuries. I mean, that's still a team that's producing, 5-star talent on a regular basis. They moved the ball more so than I thought that they could have, even with a good offense. I mean, they were sort of one-dimensional to an extent going into that game. Book and his receivers weren't necessarily playing their best football, but the offensive line and the rushing attack was dominant. And one thing I was scared of was that they'd be able to stop the rushing attack more so than other teams were, and then Book and the receivers weren't going to be able to make plays down the field. And that was pretty much the exact opposite of what happened. And it continued on against Boston College. The receivers are growing with confidence. Book's playing his best football. And at this point, I'd be pretty surprised that if there was a defense in the country that would be able to contain them, at least to an extent where they wouldn't be able to put up some points.
Nathan Urbach talking Notre Dame football here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Follow Nathan on Twitter, and hopefully we'll get that podcast going week to week, and we'll be able to publicize that, get it out there as well. Always appreciate you coming on board, Nathan.
Absolutely. Thanks, John.